The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by High Stick NT, Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans, and Pride Seeds.
Tell us a little bit about what we know about how soybeans perform under drought stress.
There's been a lot of work in the past on soybean performance under water stress, most of it in the United States, in the Corn Belt. Not a lot of information about water stress here in Ontario and how it affects soybean. And we've been working on water stress traits for a long time, but it wasn't until recently that we started asking the question, well, does this really matter? How much yield are we actually losing to water stress with our Ontario soybean? So we actually started a project in 2009 with funding from Grain Farmers of Ontario and Agricultural Adaptation Council to try to quantify that. So it was a pretty simple question and a pretty simple experiment. We just grew commercially adapted soybean varieties in the field under rain-fed conditions, or normal conditions here in sort of southwestern Ontario, and compared them to irrigated. So we could quantify if there's no water restriction whatsoever, if the crop was always water replete, how much extra yield would you get? So that's our estimate then of the yield that we're losing to water stress. And we were fairly surprised by the results. Based on theory, we sort of expected that there would always be a time in the season when a soybean crop was water stressed. Because even though we receive enough water during the season to finish the crop, and we get as much water as the crop uses in a season, it's not all perfectly distributed over the season. So at some point, you usually end up with a water deficit. And in fact, we found that in all 3 years of the study. So our yield increases from applying irrigation water ranged from about 8.5% to as high as 24%, depending on the year. Those were 3 years, 2009, 10, and 11. So we know that there's water stress. We know that pretty much always, even when we have really well distributed rainfall, at some point in the season the crop is lacking for water and yields are affected. So let me show you the weather data from 2009, 2010, and 2011 so we can see how the precipitation differed and what effect that had on soybean yields. So here are the weather data from 2009. Most of this is showing precipitation data. So the black line here shows 10-year average cumulative precipitation at our research site near Elora, Ontario. And so when you look at average precipitation across 10 years, it looks like it's very evenly distributed across a year. But the light blue line here is the actual cumulative precipitation for 2009. So then ended up around, this is during the actual growing season from planting till harvest. Just over 10, maybe about 11 inches of rain total, so over 250 millimeters of cumulative rainfall. But you can see that there's little dry spells in here, especially here right at the end nearing the final stages of grain filling. And that was actually enough to reduce the yield. The darker blue line there is what we applied as irrigation water in addition to the precipitation. So we ended up with this difference in water at the end of the season in the irrigated treatment. So it really wasn't a lot of water we added because this year the rainfall really was very nicely distributed and we didn't feel like we had water stress very often. The other thing I'll just show you about these graphs, these red squares here represent the weekly high temperature mean. So anything above the dotted line there, that's a hot week, and anything below the dotted line is a cool week. So 2009 was generally a cooler season with really nicely distributed rainfall across the season. Even in that type of year, though, we ended up with almost a 10% yield increase through irrigation, which indicates to us that under rain-fed conditions, we were actually losing 10% of our yield due to water stress, even in this nearly ideal season. These are the weather data for 2010. Again, the black line is your 10-year average cumulative precipitation. And you'll see the thing about 2010, and many people will remember this, is that there was a lot of rainfall. So the total seasonal cumulative rainfall was much, much higher than the average. But again, you'll see that there are times during the season when there wasn't really very much rainfall. So we had a lot early, but then there was a sort of dry spell mid-season, and we were able to add irrigation water again to alleviate the stress. So even in this type of season, when the total cumulative rainfall was much higher than normal, we still got almost a 9% yield increase by adding irrigation water. So again, even with above average rainfall, At some point in the season, the soybean crop is water stressed. So this leads us to say, in general, that basically soybean is always water stressed in Ontario. So here are the data for 2011. Again, the black line is your 10-year cumulative rainfall. And the main feature of precipitation in that year was in the early part of the season, we had an extended dry period. So we were well below the 10-year average accumulation. So by applying irrigation water, we're able to keep our cumulative total water similar to the 10-year average precipitation. Then all that water that we missed in the early season came, we got it all back essentially, and after that the season ended up just exactly like the 10-year average. In this year, with this early season water stress and also very high temperatures during the early season, we actually got almost a 24% increase in yield with the irrigation water. So in this sort of year where we had very, very typical total cumulative rainfall, but an early season dry spell, we were losing about 24% of our yield to water stress.